A passenger tried to humiliate a black CEO's teen on a flight. What happened next turned the whole cabin silent. He thought forcing a child to choke would prove dominance. He didn't realize the man watching was the boy's father, and justice was already in motion. Subscribe if you believe cruelty never stays unpunished. The turbulence struck like a brief shudder through the plane's spine, just enough to make cups rattle and eyes lift. Dr. Nathaniel Voss steadied his tablet with one hand, his other arm instinctively reaching out in front of his son, Jordan, seated beside him. Across the aisle, the man in 12C didn't just flinch, he snapped. Perry Doran, mid-40s, shoulders hunched and coat rumpled with the stale scent of sweat and bitterness, had already been simmering. Now, as his paper cup of ginger ale tipped and soaked the corner of his in-flight magazine, his eyes flicked toward Jordan with a glare sharpened by something far older than spilled soda. "You think this is funny?" he muttered under his breath, shaking droplets off his hand as if they were insults thrown at him. Jordan, earbuds in, had been chuckling at a joke printed in bold type, something harmless about airline peanuts and flight delays. He didn't notice the venom in Perry's voice or the way the man's knuckles whitened around the edges of his seat tray. Nathaniel noticed. His eyes shifted, just for a second, from the notes on his screen to the strained tension coiling in the seat across the aisle. He saw the way Perry's lip curled, the way his gaze lingered on Jordan a little too long, the way one hand slid into the seat pocket and returned gripping the edge of a rolled-up magazine. Nathaniel didn't speak. Not yet. The move could have meant nothing, but decades of boardroom battles had trained him to sense when silence masked intent. Jordan pulled out one earbud. "What's up?" he asked, noticing the stillness in his father's stare. Nathaniel smiled lightly, but his voice was low. "Nothing, son. Just keep your music low for now." Across the aisle, Perry shifted again, his mouth twitching as if biting back more than words. His fingers tapped the magazine's spine like it was a fuse waiting to be lit. The flight attendant rolled past with the drink cart, offering a brief moment of distraction. Nathaniel glanced down at his notes again, not because he needed to, but because he knew watching Perry too long might provoke him. There was no law against looking angry, no policy against muttering, but Nathaniel had seen too many seemingly ordinary men snap in unpredictable ways. The tension didn't fade. Every now and then, Perry shot glances like flares, quick, darting, hot with judgment. He seemed to hate the way Nathaniel sat upright with calm dignity. He seemed to despise the way Jordan smiled so freely. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his seat, his breath measured, and adjusted his seatbelt. "People carry storms inside them, son," he said softly, not taking his eyes off his tablet. "And sometimes they need a place to land." Jordan raised an eyebrow, confused, but didn't respond. The overhead lights dimmed as the captain announced mild turbulence ahead. Nathaniel's fingers paused over the touchscreen. He knew the words were routine, but his instincts itched. He looked once more at Perry. The man was no longer tapping. He was staring, flat, hard, and unblinking. Then came the moment that sealed the tension into something colder. Another light shake. Nothing major. A few gasps from first-time flyers. But Perry seized the moment. He slammed his tray shut, muttering again, louder this time. "Privilege always laughs the loudest." Nathaniel turned to face him fully now. "Excuse me," Perry sneered. "Your boy finds everything funny. Maybe he wouldn't if he ever had to work for something." Jordan sat up straighter, surprised. "I wasn't laughing at you." "Doesn't matter," Perry cut him off. "You think the world's yours 'cause your daddy's got a fancy watch and a big mouth." Nathaniel kept his voice calm but firm. "That's enough." "Oh, is it?" Perry's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Man like you thinks you can just sit there all calm, act like none of us exist." Passengers nearby began shifting. A man in 13A glanced nervously over his shoulder. A young boy 2 rows back asked his father if something was wrong. Nathaniel straightened his jacket, his heart pounding slower than it felt. I'm here to take my son to a conference. That's all. We don't want trouble. Perry leaned forward, elbows on knees, his voice low and full of acid. Trouble's already here. That line lingered in the air long after he sat back. Nathaniel felt it coil around him like smoke, foreboding, invisible to most, but unmistakable. He'd read men like this before, in courtrooms, in elevators, on panels, men who thought control was their birthright, and anything that challenged it, especially quiet confidence in someone like Nathaniel, was an insult. He shifted his eyes toward the front of the cabin. The crew hadn't noticed yet. Or maybe they had, and were choosing silence. Jordan leaned closer. Is he going to do something? I don't know, Nathaniel said. His voice was gentle, but the weight behind it was steel. But stay alert. And stay close. For a few minutes, the cabin went still. The kind of stillness where every sound, pages flipping, shoes scuffing, the occasional cough, feels exaggerated. Perry said nothing more. But Nathaniel saw his jaw clench. He saw the slow, deliberate way the man adjusted his seatbelt. He saw the magazine still in his lap, fingers curling around it as if testing its edge. The sense of control Nathaniel had cultivated all his life, the armor of calm, intellect, and presence, felt like it was being tested, inch by inch. Still, he refused to show fear. He reached over and placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. We're almost there, he said. Jordan nodded, trying to smile. But the innocence in his eyes was fading, replaced by the dawning awareness that sometimes the world didn't wait for you to be ready. Outside, clouds turned orange with the setting sun. Inside, the shadows stretched longer. Nathaniel returned to his tablet, but his mind was no longer on propulsion systems or keynote speeches. It was calculating, watching, preparing, because he'd seen the look in Perry's eyes before, the look of a man not planning to land quietly. The boy beside him represented something to Perry. He didn't yet know what, but Nathaniel knew this. Sometimes danger doesn't come from the sky. It sits right beside you. The first sign of violence was not a scream. It was a sudden, savage blur of movement. Perry Doran lunged from his seat across the aisle, his arm arcing with unnatural speed. In his hand, a crumpled wad of thick paper slick with something wet. Before Jordan could even register the motion, the object slammed into his face with brutal force. The magazine page, soaked in sticky industrial glue, clung immediately to the boy's mouth and cheek. The impact drove the paper partially between Jordan's lips, and Perry's hand shoved forward again, harder this time, jamming it deeper. The glue spread fast, like fire on oil. Jordan's eyes flew wide, a garbled gasp erupting as his head hit the seat back. Panic seized his chest as his mouth was sealed with something meant to suffocate, not silence. A half-second later, Nathaniel Voss unbuckled and sprang to his feet. He hadn't even looked up when Perry first moved. He'd felt it. Some primal warning in the air, a disturbance in the space beside his son, like gravity had shifted. Now he saw it all in front of him, and the sight shattered something inside him. Jordan clawing at his own face, Perry's sneering expression as he held the glued page with one hand and gripped the boy's jaw with the other. "Get your hands off my S-on!" Nathaniel's voice exploded through the cabin, deeper than panic, sharper than any alarm. He launched himself across the row in a single motion, one hand wrenching Perry's arm backward, the other reaching to rip the magazine from Jordan's face. But the glue held fast. The boy's skin stretched painfully as Nathaniel peeled the paper away, his hands trembling between precision and fury. Jordan choked violently, the glue catching in his throat, his chest heaving in short, sharp bursts. Gasps erupted around them. A tray table clattered to the floor. A drink cart, half rolled down the aisle, tipped sideways and slammed against a row of seats, scattering plastic cups and bottles. Several passengers jumped to their feet, but none moved forward. One man fumbled for the call button. Another ducked down, muttering a prayer. In the chaos, Perry stood still, chest rising and falling with smug satisfaction. He laughed, Nathaniel would later recall. He stood there and laughed. Jordan coughed hard enough to bend over, sticky threads of glue stretching from his lips as he tried to speak. His earbuds hung limp from one shoulder, still playing faint music, absurdly calm. Nathaniel grabbed a napkin from the nearest seat pocket, trying to wipe away what he could. Jordan's lips were raw, patches of skin already reddening where the adhesive had pulled too hard. Perry finally spoke. "Kid needed to learn," he said, voice thick with contempt. "Too loud. Too full of himself. Thought this was his world." Nathaniel turned, locking eyes with him. "I warned you," he said coldly, remembering the earlier muttered threats, the tension no one had addressed. "I told you not to start something you couldn't control." "Control?" Perry scoffed. "You think you're in control?" One of the attendants, young, bearded, name tag reading Theo, ran down the aisle. "Sir, please, everyone stay calm. We need space to respond." Nathaniel raised one hand instinctively to shield Jordan, his other arm still partially around his son's shoulder. Theo stepped between him and Perry, trying to create distance. But Perry wasn't finished. He picked up another rolled magazine from the seat pocket and held it like a club. "Back away," Theo warned, voice shaking but firm. "You're done." The tension pulsed like electricity. A deep, low rumble of turbulence rolled under their feet again, minor but enough to shake the floor and make luggage bins creak. The cabin lights dimmed momentarily, flickering. Jordan slowly sat up straighter, still pale, lips trembling from the sting. His voice came out small but clear. "I didn't do anything." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He stood tall, shielding Jordan with his frame. "You think this is about doing something?" Perry spat. "This is about people like you always thinking you're better." Always above the rest of us, passengers murmured, uncomfortable but frozen. One attendant pulled out a phone. Another whispered into the intercom to contact the cockpit. Nathaniel didn't move, but inside the floodgates were cracking. His mind raced. Jordan was safe for now. He was breathing. But the pain on his son's face wasn't physical alone. It was humiliation, violation, and all while others watched. Nathaniel had been calm his entire career, but calm no longer felt sufficient. He stepped closer to Perry. Just one step, enough to send a signal. "You assaulted my son," he said quietly, "in front of witnesses, on federal airspace, and you think I won't act because of the suit I wear?" Perry smirked, tapping the glue tube in his pocket like a trophy. "What are you going to do? Cry about it?" Before Nathaniel could answer, a second attendant joined Theo, larger, built like a former athlete. Together they reached for Perry's arms, trying to detain him. He resisted, shoving one elbow back into Theo's ribs. The larger attendant tackled Perry from behind, knocking the glue tube to the floor where it rolled under a seat. Jordan flinched at the sound, curling slightly toward his father. Nathaniel looked down and saw the label. Permanent industrial adhesive. Medical attention required for dermal contact. He picked it up with a napkin, wrapping it tightly. Theo turned to him breathless. "Sir, he'll be restrained." "We're initiating emergency protocol with the captain. Please stay seated." Nathaniel nodded once, but his eyes never left Perry, who now sat against the aisle wall, hands zip-tied by trembling crew. His voice had dropped to a mutter, repeating something incoherent, possibly a chant, possibly a threat. Nathaniel guided Jordan back into the seat. The boy's hand gripped his wrist tightly. The cabin, though physically restored, felt utterly changed. No longer a vessel of travel, but of trauma. A few seats back, someone whispered, "They should have landed already." Nathaniel adjusted Jordan's seatbelt with slow care, the motion gentler than anything else in the cabin. In his mind, a single truth formed, heavier than rage. A single act of cruelty can turn the air thin for everyone. Nathaniel's hand shot forward, ripping the glued magazine from his son's mouth in one swift motion. The tearing sound was sharp, like fabric ripping under pressure, but the silence that followed was sharper. Glue smeared across Jordan's cheeks, thick and sticky, clinging like tar. The boy gasped, coughing violently, his body folding inward as he struggled to suck in air. His lips trembled. His eyes watered. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Nathaniel cupped the back of his son's head, steadying him, his other hand trembling, torn between panic and a rising, explosive fury. "Jordan, breathe, son. You're okay. You're okay," he whispered, his voice strained and shaking. All around them, seats shifted and passengers turned alarmed. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by the scraping sound of a drink cart being shoved aside. Two flight attendants, one in his 20s, another middle-aged with silver hair, rushed from opposite ends of the aisle. Their uniforms were neat, but their faces betrayed panic. Perry Doran stood just a few feet away, hands twitching, shoulders heaving. He wasn't finished. His face was red, not from embarrassment but from righteous rage, the kind of delusion that wears a smirk. He jabbed a finger at Jordan and shouted, "That boy needed to be silenced." Someone had to do it. The words hit the cabin like an icy gust. Passengers recoiled, some in disbelief, others too stunned to speak. A woman near the exit row clutched her seatbelt. A man with headphones pulled them off, looking around as though trying to piece together what world he had just woken into. But no one moved to help. They watched. Nathaniel's chest heaved as he turned toward Perry. His eyes locked in, cold and controlled, the fury contained behind a wall of dignity. His instincts screamed for retaliation, but his judgment held firm, for now. One wrong move could escalate everything. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every hesitation. Behind them, the captain's voice came over the speaker, taut and urgent. "Cabin crew, initiate emergency passenger restraint protocol. Subdue the hostile individual near row 6 immediately." But the order came too late. Perry lunged again. This time he grabbed another rolled magazine from his seat pocket, his hand still sticky with glue. He held it like a club. The look in his eyes wasn't rage, it was calculation. He wasn't flailing. He was aiming. Nathaniel reacted without hesitation. He stepped in front of his son, body squared. As Perry charged into the narrow aisle, arms raised, Nathaniel ducked slightly to shield Jordan. But the cabin layout made fighting nearly impossible. Armrests dug into ribs, elbows slammed into plastic. Nathaniel tried to grab Perry's wrist, but the magazine struck his shoulder with a dull, paper-thick thud. "Step back," shouted one of the attendants, Theo, judging by the name tag, trying to squeeze into the chaos. Nathaniel, breathing hard, caught Theo's eye for the briefest second and tilted his chin. It was subtle, but clear. "Flank him." Theo nodded. While Perry shouted about discipline and people like you, Nathaniel moved left, pretending to stumble. It worked. Perry followed him, angling his aggression toward the father, and in that opening, Theo surged forward, wrapping his arms around Perry's torso. But Perry thrashed like a trapped animal, twisting, elbowing Theo in the jaw. The flight attendant grunted but held on, wrestling the attacker backward into the aisle wall. Nathaniel, heart pounding, reached back to make sure Jordan was still behind him. The boy stood on shaking legs, a streak of glue across his chin, his body trembling but upright. His voice was hoarse. "Dad, I'm okay." He wasn't, but the words mattered. Perry sneered. "You're teaching him weakness." "This is why?" "That's enough," Nathaniel snapped, voice low and steel-edged. Passengers still didn't move. A man raised his phone to film. A child clung to his father's sleeve in the back row. The whole cabin felt suspended between two realities, one where justice was calm and one where it erupted. Nathaniel watched as Perry twisted violently out of Theo's hold, sending the attendant stumbling against a row of seats. It was a brief slip, but enough. Nathaniel stepped forward, hand raised, not to strike, but to block. Perry swung the magazine again, but Nathaniel caught his wrist mid-air. Their faces were inches apart now. "You've chosen the wrong lesson to teach," Nathaniel said, voice like quiet thunder. His grip tightened, and for the first time, Perry's confidence cracked. Passengers watched as silence fell again. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that arrives just before a verdict. "Sometimes," Nathaniel murmured as he slowly released Perry's arm, "even silence can sound like thunder waiting to strike." Perry's shout cracked through the cabin like lightning splitting a silent sky. "Discipline! That boy needs discipline!" he bellowed, his face contorted with a flush of delusional righteousness, spit flying as his eyes locked on Jordan with manic intensity. His voice cut through the startled murmurs and rattling trays, sending a jolt of alarm across the rows of passengers. Nathaniel rose slowly from his seat, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. His frame, tall, composed, precise, shifted like a storm cloud thickening over calm waters. But behind that stillness, a fury brewed so intense it nearly fractured his restraint. Perry raised the rolled magazine again, the same one he had used to assault Jordan, waving it like a badge of authority. But before Nathaniel could intercept, Jordan, still trembling, glue drying along the corner of his mouth, stood between them. "Don't," the boy said, voice barely a whisper. His arms were shaking, knees uncertain, but his eyes refused to look away from Perry's. "Sit down, son," Nathaniel commanded. His voice didn't rise. It cut, like steel drawn from a sheath. The boy hesitated for a second more, then nodded and backed down, his chest rising and falling fast. Nathaniel never took his eyes off Perry. Every instinct screamed to respond with force, but decades of leadership had taught him better. Patience, precision, not rage. Behind him, the crew scrambled to control the cabin. Two male flight attendants, Theo, the more experienced one, and Marvin, barely in his 20s, rushed forward with zip ties trying to keep Perry contained. Passengers were on edge, some filming with shaky hands, others frozen in their seats. No one stepped in. As Marvin leaned in, Perry jolted sideways, elbowing him in the rib and barking something incoherent about entitled families. Theo managed to slip a zip tie over one wrist, but Perry thrashed violently, kicking over a tray cart and nearly hitting a seated passenger. One of the attendants shouted, "We need backup, now!" In the middle of the chaos, Nathaniel's gaze shifted downward, something glinting under the seat. The glue tube. He reached down and picked it up carefully, turning it in his fingers. The label was faint, scratched by friction, but clear enough. Industrial adhesive. Not something found in craft kits or school bags. This wasn't random. It was calculated. He turned it once more in his hand and quietly slipped it into the inner pocket of his blazer. The intent behind it was unmistakable. This was never about anger. It was malice, prepared and executed. Perry, now partially restrained and forced into the last row by Theo and Marvin, sneered through his reddened face, sweat shining at his temples. "What now, boss man?" he taunted, his voice mocking. "Gonna sue me?" "Call your lawyers?" Nathaniel didn't respond. His silence wasn't empty. It was a warning wrapped in steel. Instead, he turned to Jordan, gently taking a cloth from a service cart and wiping the dried glue from his son's face. Jordan flinched at first but allowed it, his lips quivering slightly, more from shame than pain. "It's okay," Nathaniel said quietly, almost to himself. But he wasn't speaking of comfort. He was speaking of calculation. While the crew notified the cockpit and assured the passengers things were under control, Nathaniel memorized everything. The sharp arch of Perry's knuckles, the torn corner of the magazine with faint print ink on the edge, the sound of his voice when he laughed after the assault. These were not details. They were pieces of a puzzle he knew he'd need later. Perry didn't stop sneering. Even as he was placed under surveillance by the cabin crew in the back, he continued muttering things under his breath, sometimes chuckling, sometimes mocking Jordan loud enough for him to hear. "You know he's scared of me now," Perry growled as Theo passed. "You see it in his eyes." Just like you all should be, Nathaniel heard every word. But he didn't flinch. He sat beside his son again, eyes calm, movements slow. "Dad," Jordan murmured, his voice hoarse. "Why would someone do that?" Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He placed his hand over Jordan's, gently steadying it. He could feel the tremor, small, rhythmic, trauma echoing through a 16-year-old boy's nervous system. "Because fear makes weak men feel powerful," he finally said, "but they forget who they're dealing with." Jordan nodded, eyes on the floor, his lips pressed together. He wanted to cry but refused to. Nathaniel could see the struggle written across his face like a child learning how to carry weight meant for grown men. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly as the captain came on the intercom, assuring passengers that the situation was under control. But Nathaniel didn't relax. Not for a second. He saw it in Jordan's eyes, a kind of crack that hadn't been there before, one that went deeper than skin or bone. The cabin returned to a tentative quiet, with a few murmurs and glances thrown his way. A man in a business suit 3 rows back gave Nathaniel a small nod. Another clutched his briefcase tighter, avoiding eye contact entirely. None of it mattered. Nathaniel wasn't thinking about applause, about sympathy, or even revenge. He was thinking about the long arc of justice. This wouldn't end with landing gear. This was just the runway. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the back row where Perry sat, still defiant, still smirking. Nathaniel's mind was already at work, organizing, preparing, anticipating. There was glue on his son's lips, but the real stain was deeper, one that demanded more than a report, more than a press statement. It demanded memory, strategy, evidence. It demanded a response that echoed beyond the cabin. And it would come. He watched the seatbelt sign blink above them, almost rhythmic in its flash. The calm was returning, but he no longer trusted calm, because what happened in the sky couldn't be left in the clouds. Some things had to land harder than the plane itself. Some lessons are written in ink, others in glue. The hum of the aircraft felt heavier now, thick with unease. Jordan sat stiffly in his seat, head tilted slightly back, his throat raw and sore from the attack. A small bottle of water rested in his trembling hands, but each sip seemed to burn more than soothe. His lips were red and irritated where the adhesive had touched them. His eyes remained distant, focused on nothing in particular, lost somewhere between shame and confusion. Nathaniel didn't speak. He sat beside his son, the tablet balanced on his lap, its screen dimmed to preserve battery. His fingers moved with quiet precision, logging each detail of the incident into a timeline he was building for later use. Time-stamped entries, names of flight attendants, passenger reactions, or lack thereof, the brand of glue Perry had used. Everything documented. Not for court, at least, not yet. This wasn't about justice through official channels anymore. His thoughts were colder now, sharper, focused. Across the aisle, under a loose restraint that looked like a half-hearted effort at control, Perry Doran reclined with a smirk carved into his lips. A long, deliberate hum vibrated from his throat, mocking, off-key, and calculated. It was a grotesque mimicry of calmness, a deliberate invasion of the quiet. One of the male flight attendants, Reed, passed by and refused to meet Nathaniel's eyes. The others avoided that section of the plane altogether, as if ignoring it might erase what had happened. Nathaniel noticed it all. Passengers whispered behind upturned tablets and phones, eyes flicking between Jordan's bruised face and Nathaniel's stiff composure. Some looked away, others looked guilty. A few had recorded earlier, but no one had intervened. Not one. Nathaniel didn't blame them. Fear does strange things, but he noted it all the same. The absence of action, the silence, the quiet approval when nothing was said. Through the cabin window, the sky lay flat and unchanging. Pale, muted clouds smeared across the horizon like exhausted smoke. They stretched endlessly, offering no distraction. Nathaniel's reflection ghosted faintly on the glass. For a moment, he saw himself not as a CEO or father, but as a boy, 10 years old, sitting at a kitchen table while his father adjusted his collar and said firmly, "Never strike first." But never leave injustice unanswered. Those words had anchored him his whole life. Now, they cut deeper than ever. Jordan winced slightly, the bottle slipping from his hand. Nathaniel caught it mid-fall and set it gently on the tray table. "Breathe through your nose," he said softly, touching his son's shoulder. Jordan nodded, eyes watery but defiant. "I'm okay," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice betrayed the lie. Nathaniel turned his gaze forward again, just in time to catch the subtle movement. Perry's arm had shifted. One elbow jutted at an odd angle and his fingers twitched against the edge of his tray table. Something small and pale glinted for half a second before disappearing beneath his coat sleeve. Nathaniel's heart rate didn't spike, but his posture changed, slightly straighter, tighter. He waited. When the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for descent, the moment arrived. In the shuffle of announcements and buckled belts, Perry's hand emerged again, this time gripping a plastic fork, one of the flimsy ones from a meal tray. But it wasn't whole. The middle tines had been sharpened to a point. The handle snapped short for easy concealment. He had been working on it quietly for the last 20 minutes, scraping it against the metal hinge of the armrest. Nathaniel realized it now. Perry shifted again, testing the strength of his wrist restraints. The plastic zip tie had frayed, just enough to slide free. Nathaniel didn't alert the crew. He didn't call out. He watched. Flight attendant Reed moved down the aisle, checking trays, adjusting air vents, distracted by protocol. No one noticed as Perry's shoulder twisted, freeing his arm. Nathaniel's hands moved with clinical calm. He reached under his seat, brushing the underside of his leather carry-on. His fingers closed around a silver pen, the kind with a narrow stylus end, and pulled it free. He placed it silently on his thigh. Perry looked at him once, briefly, his eyes wild with anticipation. Nathaniel stared back with no expression. The captain's voice broke through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 7 minutes. Please ensure your seatbacks are upright and tray tables secured." Jordan looked at his father, noticing the change in his breathing, the way his eyes didn't blink. "Dad?" Jordan whispered. Nathaniel didn't answer. He just placed his hand on Jordan's arm. A pause, a reassurance, a silent command to stay still. Perry slowly began to lean forward, his body shifting toward the aisle. The fork was gripped tight in his palm, tip aimed low, ready to strike not in rage, but with planned cruelty. Nathaniel leaned in, just enough to whisper across the aisle, "I saw what you took." Perry froze, his mouth curled into a sneer. "You going to stop me?" he muttered. "No," Nathaniel said calmly. "I'm going to end it." Reed turned just then and spotted the fork, but not fast enough. Perry was already half out of his seat. In one fluid movement, Nathaniel stood, pivoted, and blocked the narrow aisle with his frame. The silver pen glinted in his hand, not raised to stab, but held like a scalpel. Perry hesitated, not from fear, but confusion. "Don't," Nathaniel said, voice low. "Not in front of him." His glance nodded toward Jordan. Perry's smirk faltered. A beat passed. Reed finally shouted, "Sir!" "Sit down." But Perry had already collapsed back into his seat, panting, eyes darting. Nathaniel didn't move. He didn't blink. He bent down and picked up the half-broken restraint from the floor, tossed it to Reed without looking, and returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. The hum of the plane continued. Jordan stared at his father, uncertain of what had just passed. But Nathaniel didn't explain. He resumed typing on his tablet, fingers calm. Above them, the cabin lights glowed soft and dim as the landing gear deployed. Nathaniel watched Perry out of the corner of his eye the entire time. He didn't just want justice anymore. He wanted closure. The wheels screamed against the tarmac as Flight 812 touched down in a haze of tension and disbelief. The cabin, usually filled with the shuffling of passengers and soft beeps of seatbelt signs, was locked in a silence so thick it seemed to muffle even the roar of the engines. No one moved. Eyes darted. Breath held. Nathaniel Voss's hand remained gently on his son's shoulder, grounding him, anchoring them both to something still intact amid the chaos. Jordan's lips were raw, the glue now hardened in patches across his skin. He winced with each breath but nodded to his father's calm, silent glance. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, paramedics were already waiting on the tarmac. A flight attendant opened the cabin door, and a rush of night air swept through like the release of a pressure valve. "We can take a look at him," one of the paramedics offered, stepping inside with a clipboard and cautious tone, but Nathaniel simply raised a hand, firm yet not unkind. "He's breathing," he said quietly. "We'll handle it once we're off this plane." The medical crew hesitated, sensing the authority in his voice, not just the tone of a protective father, but the weight of a man used to commanding rooms much larger than cabins. Behind them, Perry Doran was dragged from his seat by two security officers, still muttering bitterly as the zip ties chafed against his wrists. His voice was hoarse but loud. "You're all just scared of the truth." "He provoked me. He made me do it with his spoiled little attitude." The words struck the air like sparks looking for fuel. Passengers pulled out phones, some recording, others whispering. Nathaniel didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The cameras were already capturing what mattered, the way he stood beside his son, unmoving, steady, unshaken even in the face of something most fathers couldn't imagine. The father of the boy who had been silenced with glue, standing in the light of dozens of lenses, saying nothing. Because sometimes, silence was the loudest statement of all. Inside the terminal, the transition was jarring. Bright fluorescent lights, polished floors, the artificial calm of a place designed to process movement. But here, everything felt paused. A local investigator named Rowan Dax approached, his badge clipped to his lapel, his suit one size too large, as if borrowed from someone with more experience. He extended a hand toward Nathaniel, who shook it cautiously. "We've reviewed the preliminary statement from the crew. Mr. Doran will face charges for assault. I promise you we'll pursue this," Dax said, offering a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Nathaniel studied him. Dax's posture was too loose. His glance flickered over to a nearby airline representative more than once, and when he mentioned the word charges, there was a delay. A hesitation, as though checking to see how much weight the word would carry with a man like Voss. "Good," Nathaniel said. "Then I assume he'll be held overnight." Dax scratched the back of his neck. "We're processing everything. It's technically a municipal matter until the full report is filed. There's a release review process, but it's standard." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Jordan, sitting nearby, ran a finger along the rim of a water bottle. Not drinking, just distracting himself. His eyes were half closed, but his voice was steady when he asked, "So, he's getting out?" Dax fumbled for words. No one's saying that. We just need to follow protocol." 3 hours later, the protocol delivered its verdict. In the sterile lights of the airport holding area, a security staffer, eyes down, voice soft, announced that Perry Doran had been released. His lawyer argued self-defense, he explained. It's not final. Charges are still pending. Nathaniel didn't speak. He didn't move. Only his gaze shifted to the glass door of the terminal, beyond which Perry walked freely, escorted not by officers but by a man in a gray blazer and sunglasses. He wasn't even looking back. He was smiling. Nathaniel's lawyer, a sharp-eyed legal director from Valarin named Nolan Redden, arrived minutes later. His phone was already buzzing. "This is procedural nonsense," he snapped, flipping through court filing apps, trying to make sense of a situation that refused to follow logic. They're going to argue a mutual misunderstanding, already drafting statements from the airline's legal. Liability avoidance. They're trying to bury it before it starts. Nathaniel turned to him, voice still composed. "Then we won't let them." They exited quietly, with Jordan leaning into his father's side. Outside, the car waited. The city lights of Riddell flickered in the distance, ordinary and unbothered. But the night was different for them now. Later, in the hotel room, Jordan sat on the bed with a warm cloth pressed to his lips. The glue had burned where it touched his inner cheek, and though he had barely cried during the flight, something about the quiet room made him suddenly fragile. His voice cracked. "Dad, what if they just let him go?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He stood at the window, staring out at the skyline, hands behind his back like a commander staring down a battlefield no one else could see. When he finally spoke, the words were slow, icy, measured. "Then I'll make sure no one ever forgets what he did." When silence becomes denial, truth must find another voice. The footage was corrupted. Nathaniel Voss stared at the playback monitor in his private office, jaw tight, hand frozen on the pause button. The grainy cabin video from Horizon Flight 812 played cleanly for a few minutes, showing the ordinary stir of passengers, the drink carts, the subtle cabin chatter, but then, just as the timestamp approached the moment Perry Doran had attacked Jordan, the screen glitched. Pixels scrambled. The image warped as if swallowed by static, and then jumped ahead several minutes, completely bypassing the incident. Nathaniel leaned back slowly, his face unreadable, but his eyes, dark, sharp, were blazing with quiet fire. "Elias," he called. His assistant appeared in the doorway within seconds, tablet in hand. Elias Marron had been with him for nearly a decade, loyal, methodical, and fiercely intelligent. He said nothing, waiting. "Find out who handled the footage transfer to authorities," Nathaniel said without looking up. "Cross-reference timestamps with maintenance logs. Something's been cut." Elias nodded once and vanished. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. The video wasn't just tampered with, it was sanitized. Someone didn't want the world to see what had happened to Jordan, and someone had the access to make it disappear. 3 hours later, Elias returned with a name. Lorne Pike, a senior technician contracted by Horizon's in-house security vendor. More troubling, Lorne was the nephew of Douglas Vane, Horizon's executive director of operations. The implications hit like a drumbeat. The cover-up wasn't rogue, it was embedded. Nathaniel stood silently by the window of his office, watching a storm roll over Ember City. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Behind him, Elias waited for instruction. Nathaniel finally turned. "They're staging a narrative," he said, his voice low. "They want the public to believe this was a scuffle." "A misunderstanding." Elias looked troubled. "The media's already biting. Horizon's prepping a statement. Both parties engaged in a heated disagreement." That's the phrasing. Nathaniel blinked once. "My son was assaulted." And they're painting it as a mutual escalation. He walked to his desk, sat down, and opened a blank encrypted folder on his device. Slowly, deliberately, he titled it, Operation Spine. "If they want a quiet storm," he murmured, "we'll give them thunder." That night, Jordan came home from his first day back at school with his shoulders slumped, hoodie pulled tight around his face. Nathaniel was waiting in the kitchen. Jordan said nothing at first, just set his backpack down and opened the fridge mechanically. Then, quietly, he added, "Some of them said you made it up." "That you staged it for attention." Nathaniel turned slowly, something cold pressing against his heart. "I didn't say anything," Jordan continued. "I just walked away." Nathaniel placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "You did exactly what you were supposed to. Let me handle the rest." But inside, Nathaniel was unraveling. The lies were spreading, and with every whisper, the truth dimmed. He called a name from the past. Darren Miles, an independent investigative journalist who'd made headlines 2 years ago for taking down a corrupt aviation board. Darren was known for 3 things: his relentless pursuit of corporate negligence, his airtight sourcing, and his refusal to be bought. Nathaniel left him a secure message. "I have a file. I need 10 minutes of your time. You'll want more." The response came within the hour. Midnight. Studios dark. Bring everything. By 11:30, Nathaniel stood outside a low-rise building tucked between abandoned rail lines and freight warehouses on the eastern edge of Ember City. The air was damp, the street lamp flickering. He carried a single black folder, thick with documents, still warm from the printer. Inside it, technician logs, corrupted frame breakdowns, internal memos with timestamps circled in red ink and sealed in a clear bag, the torn, glue-stiffened magazine spine, a piece of the weapon that had silenced his son. Inside, Darren waited under a single hanging bulb, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his desk cluttered with cables and old hard drives. He offered no handshake, just a nod. Nathaniel set the folder on the desk. "This is bigger than one man, bigger than one airline," he said. Darren opened the folder, eyes scanning fast but alert. His fingers paused on the bagged spine. "What is this?" Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Proof that it wasn't random. Proof that they're building a defense while burying the truth." Darren looked up slowly. "And you're ready to burn it all down?" "I don't care about the flames," Nathaniel said, his voice like steel. "I care about what rises from the ashes." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a flash drive, and placed it on the table. "Off-site backups, redundant files. Password will come later." Darren closed the folder with deliberate calm. "They're not going to take this lightly." Nathaniel nodded. "Good." He turned to leave, the shadows of the warehouse wrapping around him like armor. Behind him, Darren called out, "What do you want the headline to say?" Nathaniel didn't pause. He kept walking, his voice echoing down the corridor as he disappeared into the dark. "If they want to bury the truth," he says, placing it on the table, "I'll make them choke on it." He jammed a glued magazine into the teen's mouth, laughing as the boy gasped and blood mixed with paper. If you believe silence in the face of brutality is guilt, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't wait, it reacts. No warning, no teaser, no narration. Just 31 seconds of raw footage. Perry Doran's hand gripping the aviation magazine, the blur of movement as he shoved the glue-soaked pages into Jordan's open mouth, and the boy's muffled, panicked gasp as the adhesive sealed across his lips. By 9 a.m., the clip had spread across every major platform. By 10:15, Nathaniel Voss's inbox held more than 600 messages, some supportive, others vile, and a growing number of veiled threats. He sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn against the media vans now parked outside his home. His laptop screen played the video on loop. Each time he flinched at the sound Jordan made when the paper hit the back of his throat. That wet, strangled noise now lived in his bones. On the TV in the corner, news anchors tripped over each other trying to explain the footage. One panel argued whether Perry had a history of mental instability. Another speculated if the incident had been staged. Horizon released a statement mid-morning, calling it an unfortunate disagreement inflamed by travel stress, while simultaneously hiring Whitlow Strategies, a crisis PR firm known for silencing corporate scandals with surgical efficiency. Nathaniel didn't respond publicly. Not yet. Instead, he called Elias Moran. "Find the ledger," he said quietly, gripping the edge of the desk. "Follow the money. I want names." An hour later, Elias called back. His voice was taut with tension. "You're going to want to sit down." "I already am. There's a shell company registered out of Luxborough. No real address. It made a wire transfer to Perry's checking account 2 days before the flight, just under $15,000. Name? Varon Asset Group. Nathaniel felt his pulse tighten. Look deeper. By dusk, the quiet inside Valarin's crisis room was cut only by the tap of Elias's keyboard and the soft churn of the air conditioning. They had pulled every available resource: forensic accountants, internal surveillance logs, backdoor access to the payment network Perry used. And there it was. The transfer from Varon had been labeled as a consulting fee, funneled through a brokerage that handled speculative investments. But a line in the memo field stopped Nathaniel cold. Event trigger. Keynote proximity impact. It wasn't personal hatred. It was orchestration. He stood slowly, his hands curling into fists. They wanted a reaction, he murmured. They needed volatility. Something to rattle investors before I unveiled our propulsion model. Elias looked up, pale. Sir, this wasn't just about silencing Jordan. Nathaniel didn't blink. It was about crashing Valarin's stock. And it nearly had. The dip in share value post-incident had wiped out $180 million in projections overnight. Had he reacted violently? Had he retaliated in the moment with anything less than precision, it could have triggered panic across the board. They didn't expect restraint, he said aloud, pacing the room. They expected chaos. Elias hesitated. Do you think Horizon knew? Nathaniel stopped walking. The silence stretched. I think Horizon built the stage. Later that night, a new message appeared in his encrypted inbox. No sender, no IP trace, just a subject line that read, You're looking in the right place. Be careful, attached was a file. Inside, 3 spreadsheets showing internal Horizon communications. One included a time-stamped entry labeled, Doran confirmed. Voss arrival locked. Monitoring reaction window. Nathaniel read it 3 times. Jordan wasn't a random victim. He was the catalyst. The plan had been to provoke a scandal that would ripple into market chaos. With Valarin's keynote coming days later, any perceived instability would spook investors and devalue Voss's public stance. Perry had been paid to trigger that chaos using the most vulnerable point: a child. Nathaniel closed the file, stood, and looked across the room to where Jordan's photo sat beside a framed print of Valarin's first aircraft prototype. He whispered through clenched teeth. They didn't just try to silence a boy. They tried to bankrupt a father. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind them. Cameras flashed through the windows as Nathaniel Voss entered with quiet precision, his jaw set, eyes sharp. He didn't look at Perry Doran, already seated at the defendant's table, nor at the media clustered just outside the gallery rail. Instead, he focused on the judge's bench, on the walls of wood and law, and on the space where truth would either rise or be buried. His legal team flanked him, 4 men in crisp suits, but it was Nathaniel who radiated authority. He was not just here to win. He was here to dismantle. The first day of testimony hit like a wave. Perry's defense opened with claims of mental instability, citing stress, past trauma, and a vaguely defined condition called impulse detachment. The courtroom murmured uneasily. Perry sat slouched, hair combed, hands folded, eyes darting toward the jury whenever the word unwell was spoken. His lawyer, Malcolm Reeve, played the sympathy card so hard it bent. My client is not a monster, he said, voice thick with rehearsed concern. He's a man who made a mistake under severe psychological strain. But Nathaniel had come prepared, and he didn't bring sympathy, he brought evidence. His lead attorney, Conrad Ellis, began methodically. Exhibit after exhibit appeared on the screen. Screenshots, financial records, voice recordings. One key moment stopped the courtroom cold, a bank transaction showing a 5-figure payment sent to Perry's personal account by a shell company, Varon Asset Group. The name drew puzzled frowns at first, but Nathaniel was already watching the ripple of unease spread through Horizon's corporate representatives seated near the back. He waited for it. Then came Darren Miles. The journalist, now a key witness, took the stand with a manila folder thick with documents and a calm demeanor. "Varon Asset is not independent," he testified, locking eyes with the jury. "It's owned by Horizon's Vice President of Strategic Development, Halden Lorick." The words fell like an axe. Audible gasps rose from the gallery. One juror's pen stopped mid-sentence. Halden Lorick, summoned by court order, arrived the next day in a tailored gray suit, but sweat marked the edges of his collar. He denied knowledge of the transaction, but the prosecution unveiled a set of internal emails, ones bearing his digital signature. In one, Halden approved PR containment measures just hours after the assault, referencing the boy and minimizing blowback. "Did you know who the boy was?" the attorney asked coldly. Halden hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "And yet you authorized a payment to the attacker." "I didn't know the full intent." "But you signed it." Silence. Halden's gaze dropped. As Halden stepped down, the weight of the case tilted visibly. Horizon's legal team conferred behind their notepads. Their stock dropped 11% overnight. Financial networks called it the Voss effect. Then came Jordan. 16 years old, still recovering, yet he walked to the stand without trembling. He wore a navy blazer too stiff for comfort and a solemn expression too old for his age. When asked what happened, he didn't cry. He didn't lash out. He described it all: the glue, the weight of the magazine, the muffled breathlessness, and the eyes that watched but did nothing. "I wasn't afraid of the pain," he said, voice clear. "I was afraid nobody would believe it mattered." One of the jurors blinked back tears. The judge leaned forward. "Young man, your courage today is noted by this court." The following hours saw Horizon's public relations crumble. Shareholders demanded resignations. Nathaniel stood outside the courthouse during a break, watching live coverage on the courthouse monitor. Headlines scrolled across the screen. "Corporate sabotage alleged in Horizon assault case." But even as victory inched closer, his mind churned with a deeper disturbance. How had Perry known Jordan's identity? The flight was booked privately. Only a few people had access to the itinerary. Late that evening, as legal teams regrouped, Nathaniel sat alone in a side room. He opened a leather notebook, flipping to a page marked with initials, staff members with access to the itinerary. His pen hovered over a single name, one that hadn't yet been mentioned in court. His grip tightened. "Sometimes," he murmured to the empty room, "betrayal board's with you long before the plane takes off." Nathaniel didn't sit down. He stood by the edge of his office window, jaw clenched, the phone still warm in his hand. The call had lasted less than 2 minutes, just long enough to fracture his trust. Elias had admitted everything. "I didn't know what they were planning," Elias had whispered, voice trembling. "They said they'd release the photos, my brother, Nathaniel. I thought I was protecting him. I didn't know they'd hurt Jordan." The room had gone silent after that. Nathaniel hadn't shouted. He hadn't accused. He had simply thanked Elias, hung up, and stared out at the skyline of Ember City. Each blinking tower light felt like a metronome ticking off the seconds of his disappointment. His thoughts spiraled as he replayed Elias's confession. It wasn't betrayal in the traditional sense. There was no malice, no greed, just fear, exploited fear. Still, the result was the same. The leak had given Varon Asset Group everything they needed to orchestrate the ambush. His son had paid the price. The sound of a package hitting the floor broke the silence. Nathaniel turned slowly to find a plain envelope, slid beneath the door. He picked it up with steady hands and opened it. Inside was a letter. From Perry. The paper was prison standard, thin, lined, official. But the words written on it didn't feel remorseful. They felt surgical, distant. Wasn't supposed to hurt the kid that badly. They told me it would be quick. I lost control. I'm not sorry for what I was told to do. I'm sorry they lied to both of us. Nathaniel dropped the letter on his desk, his fingers curling into fists. The edges of the room seemed to tighten, the air thinning with each breath. That wasn't an apology. That was justification wrapped in cowardice. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. Instead, he reached for the framed photograph of Jordan from last year's school science fair, grinning, goggles crooked, standing next to a solar drone prototype. That smile had nearly been extinguished in seat 12B of a Horizon aircraft. Nathaniel sat down and opened a blank document on his laptop. The cursor blinked, waiting. He titled it, The Voss Initiative. By morning, the first outline was complete. A campaign for national reform, one aimed at enforcing transparency and passenger protection laws. He contacted legal consultants, civil rights advocates, and aviation regulators. He reached out to fathers whose children had also been assaulted or silenced by systems designed to protect them. And he reached out to Jordan. At first, Jordan hesitated when asked to attend the conference. "I don't want people looking at me like I'm a victim," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You won't be," Nathaniel replied, placing a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "They'll see someone who didn't back down. And they'll remember who made that possible." A week later, the ballroom in Capital City filled with rows of journalists, families, lawmakers, and activists. A banner hung over the stage. The Voss Initiative. Dignity shouldn't depend on altitude. The lights dimmed. A hush fell. Nathaniel stepped up to the podium, his dark suit crisp, his face composed but solemn. Behind him on the screen was a freeze frame of the flight footage. Perry's hand pushing the glued magazine forward, Jordan's head turned in recoil. The image remained still, but the impact was visceral. He looked across the room, locking eyes with senators and airline executives alike. Then his gaze softened as it found Jordan, sitting in the front row, hands folded, chin lifted. "I was raised to believe that justice had two trials," Nathaniel began, "the one in the court and the one in the mirror. After what happened to my son aboard Horizon Flight 812, I faced both." He paused, letting the silence do its work. When an airline allows aggression to go unpunished, when corporations disguise profit tactics as passenger incidents, when children are silenced to protect shareholders, it isn't turbulence, it's betrayal. His voice hardened just slightly. Too often, we are told to be quiet, to settle privately, to forgive without reform. But I will not accept silence disguised as civility. No father should have to defend his child twice, once from violence and again from denial. The crowd rose to its feet, and as the applause echoed across the chamber like distant thunder, Jordan stood too, no longer in shadow, no longer a footnote. Just a young man whose courage had helped ignite something larger than fear. From the back of the room, Darren Miles recorded every word, knowing the final soundbite would travel farther than any courtroom argument. And in the hallways of Horizon's crumbling reputation, echoes of accountability had just begun. The momentum had shifted. The system was no longer untouchable, because the spine that broke that day became the backbone of change. The email came without a sound. No alert, no chime, just a new message quietly waiting in Nathaniel Voss's inbox when he opened his laptop at 2:17 a.m., insomnia wrapped tight around his ribs like wire. He didn't recognize the sender, just a string of characters resembling static. 0x40FHNDW13. The subject line was worse. "You broke the spine, but not the hand that wrote it." His fingers froze over the trackpad. A pulse beat in his jaw. Cautiously he clicked. One attachment. No message body. He hovered for a second longer, then opened the file. A photograph unfolded across the screen. It was Perry Doran, face leaner, hair now buzzed to stubble, seated in a gray prison jumpsuit. but it wasn't the usual mugshot. He was in what looked like a private room, seated calmly at a steel table with a newspaper held up in both hands. The Horizon Ledger. Front page headline, "The Voss Initiative Gains Global Support." The same publication that Perry had weaponized on the plane. Its spine, once soaked in glue and pressed into Jordan's mouth, now lay open in his hands as if he were casually reading it at a breakfast table. But it was the look on Perry's face that unsettled Nathaniel the most. He wasn't angry. He wasn't remorseful. He looked aware, deliberately aware. Nathaniel enlarged the image, studying the angle. It was professionally framed, the lighting even, the resolution crisp, too crisp. Cameras like this didn't belong inside prisons. This wasn't a leaked inmate photo. Someone had arranged this. His breath caught as the thought solidified. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a signal. He backed out of the image and opened the encrypted drive Elias had helped compile during the trial, metadata, communications logs, old Horizon internal memos, and the remnants of what they'd believed were dead ends. Now, the dead ends glowed with new life. Buried deep behind a triple-layered folder marked Legal Archive, Disbanded, he found a string of scanned memos, dozens of them. Most were routine, but a few bore signatures that set his teeth on edge. Lorne Pike, Halden Lorick, and another name, Raynar Darren. He didn't know the last one, but the header was what locked his attention. Stanchion Project. Tier 3, clearance required. Nathaniel opened the file. It was heavily redacted. Lines blacked out with digital ink, but certain phrases jumped out like embers from a dying fire. Target demography influence via high-stress variables. Select behavioral enforcers. Media recursion test using controlled triggers. Subject D2, Doran Perry. Approved field catalyst. He blinked, breath stalled. Perry wasn't just a violent man. They had tested him, deployed him, and then observed. The magazine wasn't random. It was a tool. His son's trauma had been planned, the pain premeditated, the silence calculated. Nathaniel pushed back from his desk, the chair scraping the hardwood. The hum of the fridge, the whisper of wind against the window pane. Suddenly, everything felt like surveillance. He turned off the lamp. Darkness embraced the room. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Just coordinates, a timestamp, and one line of text. Do not let the project wake again. He stood, heart pounding, then walked to the wall safe. Inside were the drives Elias had duplicated across 3 separate networks. Redundancy had saved them before. It would save them again. He plugged one drive into his backup system and began uploading to 3 encrypted locations simultaneously. As he did, his eyes returned to the photo of Perry. That face, that posture, that calculated stillness. They had underestimated how far it went, and how deep. Nathaniel turned off the screen and whispered, not to himself but to the shadows now gathering in the corners of his home. You thought the spine was the end. It was only the beginning. The file wasn't just a lead, it was a map. Nathaniel Voss stepped into the silent lobby of the Rydell Corporate Archives under the alias Dr. Langston Gray, his forged credentials tucked neatly into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat. He moved with the precision of a man on a mission, eyes scanning the marble floor for security cams, noting every door without signage. The receptionist barely looked up as she handed him a guest badge. She had no idea what this man was about to uncover. He gave her a polite nod, then walked briskly toward the elevator, each step punctuated by the low hum of tension building in his chest. 37 floors up, in a dim archive room lined with decades of research logs, contracts, and internal communiques, Nathaniel hunched over a terminal. The room smelled of paper and cold metal. His fingers moved fast over the keyboard. He wasn't searching for keywords. He was following buried audit trails, names disguised under department codes, Phrases like behavioral variant, response trials, and in-air empathy analysis. It wasn't long before a single name surfaced again and again: Valen Aerocorp, a Horizon subsidiary. Click. One document opened. His breath caught. Stanchion Protocol Phase 3, Live Passenger Studies, Ethics Waiver Pending. The details were chilling. Perry Doran listed as a participating agent. Parameters of study: applied conflict ignition through socially polarizing stimulus. Objective: record real-time passenger empathy patterns and racial bias fluctuations. The stimulus referred to a magazine. It was a planned object, a psychological trigger meant to provoke reaction. Jordan had been a data point. Nathaniel stared at the screen. His hand trembled. His son's pain, his boy choking on pages soaked in glue, was part of an orchestrated trial. A test. A deliberate measure of how far cruelty could go before someone reacted. And worse, how bystanders responded. He exhaled slowly, forcing the bile back down. His finger hovered over the download icon. He transferred everything: internal emails, study drafts, personnel assignments, funding trails. He printed one page, a logistics chart linking Valen Aerocorp to Horizon's legal branch and a separate notation. Contractor, Darvis Group, Behavioral Metrics Consulting, under NDA. He folded the sheet into his pocket and backed away from the terminal. The parking lot was empty when he stepped into the open air, the sun already sinking into a haze of winter dusk. His black sedan was parked at the far end near a maintenance shed. Nathaniel kept his stride measured, but his senses sharpened. A crunch of gravel behind him made him stop cold. Two men, unmarked dark coats. One stood firm with arms crossed, the other walked toward him with a calm, measured pace and a voice that didn't match the friendly tone. Mr. Voss. Or should I say, Dr. Gray? Nathaniel didn't flinch. His eyes locked on the man's. You're following the wrong person. The man stopped a few feet away, a faint smile on his lips. No. We're watching the one who opened the wrong cabinet. He leaned closer. Leave the dead files buried, or you'll be reading your son's obituary in the morning. The other man said nothing, but his hand rested loosely near a holstered baton. Nathaniel's silence was his answer. He turned and walked away. Back home, his hands shook as he connected to a private uplink server Elias had helped him build. Triple encryption, biometric lock. He uploaded the entire archive to 3 isolated servers across different regions. Then he called Darren Miles. You need to see what I found, Nathaniel said, his voice low but urgent. Darren answered immediately. Are you safe? For now, Nathaniel replied. Check your encrypted inbox in 15 minutes, and back it up. Twice by morning, the world had changed. The exposé, titled The Rydell Files, appeared across every major outlet. The data was irrefutable. Horizon's executives, Valen's behavioral lab, and their third-party government contractors were all implicated in unauthorized psychological trials on live passengers. Their goal: study the response of travelers to public provocation, particularly across racial and economic lines. Jordan had been the face of that revelation. Global outrage followed. Airlines suspended joint projects. Contracts were frozen. Senators demanded hearings. Horizon's name became a brand for betrayal. And when Nathaniel sat before the televised congressional inquiry, his calm voice cut through the noise. When profit experiments on pain, humanity loses altitude. Nathaniel stood still as the wind pushed lightly against his blazer, the bronze sculpture rising behind him like a silent sentinel. The memorial was quiet, almost reverent, but it wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the quiet that comes after thunder. The open magazine frozen in metal, its spine arched like a wounded back refusing to break, cast a long shadow across the grass. Beneath it, the plaque read, The Voss Principle. Truth cannot be folded. Beside him, Jordan took a measured breath, then stepped forward to face a small crowd of high school students gathered around the base. His voice, steady despite the faint rasp that never fully left after the incident, rang clear. Sometimes courage doesn't look like what we expect. Sometimes it's what you don't do that defines you. The students listened closely, some clutching notepads, others with phones recording. Jordan didn't flinch under their gaze. He had grown, not just older, but sturdier. Nathaniel watched his son with quiet pride, his hands clasped behind his back. A year ago, that boy had been silenced with paper and glue. Now he was speaking in front of the nation's youth, passing on a truth that had been earned, not taught. Yet beneath the pride, there was a melancholy weight. This moment, this memorial, this strength, they had all come at a cost. As the students began to scatter, their teacher leading them back toward the bus, Nathaniel caught movement from the side of the monument. Darren Miles approached, his coat flapping slightly in the breeze, a folded newspaper in hand. His face was solemn, but lit with the hint of something triumphant. "They passed it," Darren said without preamble. "Just got out of the chamber 20 minutes ago. It's done." Nathaniel turned to face him fully. "Unanimous." "Nearly. They're calling it the Passenger Integrity Act. The Voss bill informally." For a moment, Nathaniel didn't speak. The name felt heavy. Fitting, but heavy. He looked past Darren toward the sculpture, its sharp lines catching the late afternoon sun. "And Horizon?" Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Dissolved. Their assets frozen pending federal redistribution. Valen's executives have been indicted, human rights violations, fraud, and reckless endangerment." Nathaniel gave a small nod. "Perry? In solitary. Word is he paints now. Pages of magazines over and over. Some guards think it's therapy. Others think it's a message." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "A message to who?" Darren only shrugged. "Maybe to himself. Maybe to you." They stood in silence, the wind curling around the base of the statue. A group of parents passed by, murmuring about the sculpture's meaning, taking photos. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why is the magazine open like that?" The father leaned down to whisper something, but Nathaniel couldn't hear the reply. "I'm not celebrating," Nathaniel said finally. Darren looked at him with understanding. "I know. But others will, because you didn't let it die quietly." Nathaniel gave a faint smile, one without joy. Justice is loud when it needs to be. Later that night, back at his home office, the room dim except for the soft orange glow of the desk lamp, Nathaniel pulled open the drawer beneath his filing cabinet. Inside sat the thick, weathered folder marked Operation Spine. He placed it gently on the table, thumbing through the contents one last time. Notes, court transcripts, the decrypted communications, and near the top, sealed in a small archival pouch, the torn piece of the magazine spine, no longer a weapon, but a monument. He picked up a pen and added a final note to the folder's index page. Justice completed. Lesson ongoing. He exhaled, slow and steady, then closed the folder. As he did, the sunlight caught the edge of the shelf across the room, glinting off the frame that held that same magazine spine, the very one that had once silenced his son. Now, it shimmered with quiet power. From paper and glue, he built a legacy no hand could tear apart. He tried to make a boy swallow humiliation, and seconds later tasted it himself. If you believe every act of cruelty finds its mirror, subscribe now, because justice always turns the page. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the strength to stand up against cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, evoke empathy, and inspire conversations about justice, courage, and respect for human dignity.